So that is the recording started. Okay, so we have the recording started. Let's show the PowerPoint. Uh, just as a quick note, if you're watching this, I did actually do the video for last week, and I uploaded it to YouTube so that we didn't have to go back. I realize that means between last Friday and this Friday, you basically had that video to watch, but it's available. And considering I only have 2 people right now, and I usually only have about 5 people who are live, it was acceptable to me to post that video. We're going to do 2 videos today. We are going to do a little bit of review, but I had some suggestions from an advisor to change the exam a bit, just to make it more accessible, considering that a lot of you are only watching the videos after the fact, that there's no sort of live engagement, that some of the more complicated questions we're not having a discussion about. So while this is an in-person class, I mean, that's the biggest thing is I have a classroom. Those of you who signed up for this class, right, ostensibly, right, it can be argued that wanted this live interaction, but probably not at 8 o'clock in the morning. So I completely understand that. So I'm trying to find this balance of this is a live classroom, we should have live interaction, which there's no one here, right? That we can't have live interaction when there's no one here. And I keep saying we, but literally there's no one here, right? It's just me in this room. So we're going to go through the critique of Duverger. We're going to talk about political parties, the last 2 readings. Exam 3 is not going to show up till later today. I do want to post it so that it's there. It's going to be available until next Friday, so you're going to have a week to do it. And next Friday, after class is going to be a quiz due, because I think that's quiz 6, and then I'm going to do a quiz 7 for the next week, and that quiz 7 is going to replace a participation, right? Because it became very clear that even with the incentives that I have, right, that you're not going to email me, you're not going to write. I'm just having a lot of trouble getting you to connect, and I don't know if that's because I have a very different lecture style where I'm just sort of yelling at you the whole time, and you're like, okay, I'm just listening to him and taking notes, and this isn't really a discussion. And that's the nature of no one being here, right? I can't see your faces to say, okay, I need to have a discussion, or I need to ask questions, or I need to get them involved. So we're just going to have 7 quizzes, and one of the quizzes will replace the participation points. And at the end of next week, all of that should be up. So everything but the final exam you can get through. Now, normally I have to wait until the Monday of finals week to post the final exam. But I've gotten quite a bit of leeway, obviously, because of the pandemic. And one of the things that's going to happen is that right after, I don't want to say right after class, but on the Saturday after class, like as we go into finals week, the final will be available that entire week. So, right, you have a paper that's coming up, you have the final coming up. There's a lot of stuff that you have to do at the end of this semester. I will tell you the final exam, while it's worth more, it's not going to be substantially different from the exams that you've already taken. We're going to have probably more questions, a few more questions, but not substantially more. And then probably I will continue that method of 1 essay question and then 1 essay extra credit. I realize now that like the percentage that you need like 93% to get an A, but if you do all the extra credit and you do really well in the exams and you do all the things that are extra credit, you can end up with like 116% in the class. So there's this huge leeway that exists. So if you email and you're like, what should I do? The extra credits are there. And I actually saw 2 people did the extra credit. So people are taking advantage of this. All of the quizzes are open, right? So we're talking about 59% of your grade you can get up until the last minute, right? It's all there for you to go back and get the quiz points and get the extra credit and the paper. And so that's a huge portion of your grade that you can just add in, right? If you're not doing as well, you can go back. So the 3 exams are only 30%, right? So even if you did poorly, you can sort of make up everywhere. The only thing is the paper, right? You have to do a paper. So we've talked about that before. I have gotten some submissions of different qualities, right? Make sure you read the rubric. That's very important that you actually read the rubric, because if you don't, excuse me, if you don't have in-text citation, if you don't cite the works, and you don't say, this is where I got this material from, then it's hard for me to say, okay, is this person just typing out 5 pages, and this is just their opinion, right? And definitely that's not what I'm asking for. I'm asking for you to demonstrate knowledge of the material. So in the rubric, look, okay, what does he want from me so that I can get a good grade? So I had someone who submitted just a fantastic, excellent paper that made it clear that the rubric was clear, because they could just hit all the points and get a perfect score. And so I'm not one of those instructors that's like, you can't get a perfect, you can get a perfect score, you can get over a perfect score, right? That individual, I don't want to go over 20 on the paper for different reasons, but that person, even if they had written slightly better, they still have 20 because they got the early submission extra credit, right? And so when you are doing this work, make sure that you contact me if you're struggling. Next week, I'm going to be sending out a few emails to be like, okay, look, you're not passing right now. What can we do to get you back on track? And some people have sort of fallen behind and then said, hey, I had these issues, and have really caught back up, right? I had a student who was doing very poorly early in the semester, emailed me about something that was happening in their life. We made a system to where they could catch back up, and now they're doing substantially better. And I have about 8 or 9 students who are looking like they're going to get an A, which is over a third of the class, right? So it's not a difficult course. Just make sure that you're putting in the work, right? The people who are watching the videos and attending during these live sessions are really very easily getting an A in this class, right? I cover all of the questions that will be asked. All right, so without harping on that anymore, let's get into Duverger, or the critique of Duverger. So we talked about Duverger before, and remember that there is this basic argument. When you first start reading this article, I realize it's going to be like, what is happening? But remember, he's just setting up a logical argument, and he's just using variables to do that, right? And sort of all of you have had to have algebra before, so it's basically X and Y are connected in some way, and we just need to understand that process. And remember, Duverger's just basic argument is like, if you have a single winner in an election, you're going to have 2 parties. If you can have more winners, and there's more people who can win an election, you can have more parties. And so this critique starts with this idea of this historical evolution. And we're going to talk about evolution a bit, but in political science, evolution is poorly understood. In political science, often when we talk about evolution, we talk about there is an end goal, and we're sort of moving towards that end goal, always, right? We're sort of always moving toward that. That's not really how evolution works. We won't get into what evolution means, because it's an anthropology, it's sort of biological anthropology term that has a lot of clear meanings. For us, what we mean when we're talking about historical evolution is sort of these naturally changing factors. And they're changing, when we say they're changing naturally, we mean that they're sort of just driven by the environment, right? What's in the environment, what is changing because of what's in the environment. And so we start with this like normal process where you have these systems and institutions that start to form. And so whenever you have someone in power, we'll call them the incumbent, whenever the incumbent's in power, one of the things that we should always expect is an opposition to form around that people in power. And they don't have to have dramatically different policies, right? It's just party A is in power, and so party B forms to say, no, we should be in power, right? Anytime you have elections, you should expect at least 2 groups. The group that's in power, the incumbents, and the group that wants to be in power, because there are so many benefits. We've talked about incumbent advantage. We've talked about, right, rents that you can get, right? If you're a kleptocracy, there's money to be made in being in power. But there's also policy decisions, right? If you represent a group of the people, right, if you represent a subset of the population, and you say, my population isn't being served by your policies, then you say, I should be in power so that I can serve the population that I'm talking to, right? And so every time you have an incumbent, you should see an opposition. This is a very natural process, right? When we talk about competition between Democrats and Republicans in the United States, or Labor and Conservatives in the UK, or any setting that we talk about, right, you're always going to see this happen where we should expect competition. One, right, because there's incentives. There's incentives to being in power. And two, because anytime you have a policy that serves a group, it's not going to serve another group, right? So you always have this divide, right? The landed elites, the people who own land and that's their elite status, they need something very different from the people, right, who are new merchants, right? New merchants need labor to travel very easily, and landed elites don't want labor to travel. And so because of that, you get two different aspects. Real quick, could everyone just make sure that their mics are muted if they're in the WebEx? A lot of times you guys don't realize I can hear like breathing and background noise, and so just check that real quick. I'm obviously very easily distracted. So we have these two parties, a sort of natural outcome, and so this creates what Duverger says is a natural system, right? You don't need agency. You don't need people saying, I want this party. You're naturally going to have incentives for two groups that are always in competition. And so when you have a democracy, when you have any sort of electoral government or electoral regime, the first thing that he says, right, that Duverger says, is anytime you have elections, you're going to have parties. And any times that you have parties, you're going to have this at least this two group split, right? And so he says it's sufficient, right? And so we talk about this in factors of X and Y, but I don't want you to think about this algebraically. I want you to think about this parties and elections. Anytime there's elections, there's going to be parties, right? Even if you look at American history, the only time there wasn't a party system, right, that for us, right, was when George Washington was president, and it was because everyone agreed, right, almost everyone agreed that he should be president, right? They wanted to give him so much power, right, and he said, no, we should limit the executive, right? That some of the things that are unique to the American government are only unique because George Washington didn't really want to be president. He didn't want to be in charge, right? He wanted to go home and be a farmer and all those things and sort of disappear from public life. And so we have some unique situations because we were in the rare situation where you had a general who was tired of putting the nation first and wanted to retire and was fairly old for the time, right? And you have some unique aspects. But normally, when someone gets into power, they're like, I want to stay here forever. There are so many benefits, right? And so Duverger says this is sufficient. It's enough to be deterministic. If you have elections, you're going to have parties, and you're going to have this incumbent opposition split, and the type of election will determine the number of parties. A lot of people say, no, I mean, you need parties and you need elections, but one doesn't determine the other, right? There is agency, right? One of the first things that come up is there is agency. People decide what they're going to do, and so when people decide what they're going to do, you have to have non-deterministic arguments. You can't say nature will just create these two things. You have to say, okay, but people live there and they need to make decisions. And so obviously exceptions exist. And these exceptions start to give the author some reason to doubt Duverger's argument. And so this is when we get into these logical fallacies. And just as a warning, obviously I'm going to have questions about logical fallacies in the exam, right? That this is very useful for majors, for political science majors and non-majors. So when we talk about logical fallacies, a logical fallacy is when someone says this is an argument that uses logic, that says, okay, if A is here and B is here, then A leads to B, right? And then they say that, okay, these are the ways that things work, and they say, okay, so that's going to happen, right? We can say deterministically, if I drop a pencil, it's going to fall, right? That's gravity, right? But if there's some flaw in my logic, right? If I'm like, oh, well, if it falls on the surface of the Earth, of course, if you're in space, it's going to fall towards the Earth. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? That's some flawed logic. That's an extension that doesn't really exist. Just so you know, right, that the farther away you get from the surface of the Earth, right, that the less power, the less gravity you're affected by because you're not near the surface of the Earth, right? Which is why, you know, astronauts sort of float around even though they're not that far from the planet Earth, right? That there's just not as much gravity because they're far away from the mass. That's not the point. The point is, right, that obviously that extension becomes a logical fallacy. And so the author talks about very specific fallacies. And the first one is this historicist fallacy, which we've actually talked about historicist fallacies before, but we didn't name them historicist fallacies. And so a historicist fallacy says, okay, this culture, and we talked about this in the England and France statehood, how they became a state, right? England and France became a state because they were fighting wars and colonizing, and they had to form a military, and they had to sort of centralize and nationalize, and that's how they became a state. And so a historicist fallacy would say, well, then all states have to have that. They have to have authoritarian rule before they become a democracy. That's not true. We've seen African states, sub-Saharan African states, just start as a democracy and be fairly effective, right? Sub-Saharan African states, right, they suffer from a lot of issues, but there's nothing that says you can't just start as a democracy, right? There's nothing that says you have to be authoritarian and modernize, and then once you get to a certain level of income, then you can democratize, right? That's not true in all cases, and when we say that everyone has to follow that path, or everyone has to follow this import substitution path like South Korea, you have to use your labor to get an industry going, and then you can go into the global market. That doesn't mean all state has to do that. And if you say everyone has to follow that path, that's the historicist fallacy, right? It's always been done this way, so that's the way it's done. That's not necessarily true. That's a logical fallacy, right? Because you're making an assumption that may not be true. The next thing is a mystical fallacy. And the mystical fallacy has always been very problematic in political science because we talk about the state of nature, right? We say, oh, in the state of nature, things are this way, right? And I'm going to use Hobbes and Rousseau as, and I don't expect you to know Hobbes and Rousseau, I'm just using this example. And the example is clear enough that you don't need to know Hobbes and Rousseau for what we're covering, right? The mystical fallacy says the state of nature causes certain behaviors. Well, Hobbes says that life is nasty and brutish and short, and if you meet someone you don't know, you're going to try and kill them and take their stuff. Well, if that's the state of nature, if the state of nature is every time you run into someone, you try and kill them and take their stuff, then the behavior of people is going to be very different, right? You're always going to be on the defensive. You're always going to be trying to attack first, right? Because if you don't get them first, they're going to get you, right? And so in Hobbes' state of nature, you're constantly warring because you don't want to be the person who dies. You want to survive, so you have to kill everyone else, right? That's a very different nature than Rousseau's nature. And Rousseau's nature has things like, oh, we were perfect humans without technology. That we used to be able to run faster than horses and see farther than eagles. And it was technology and civilization that made us weak, right? That the reason why we're not pinnacle humans today is because we had telescopes and cars and all of these factors. And when we were first in nature, we were living in the community. There wasn't hunger because there was just so much food available and we were so able to get that food. And when we saw someone struggling, because we didn't like people to be hurting, we would reach out a hand to help them. Well, if the mystical fallacy, if nature can be those things, one is violent and selfish and completely incapable of cooperation, and the other one, people are naturally inclined to cooperate, and there's just a plentiful amount of food, and there's no real struggle in life, then those are different states of nature. And so this causes what we call a mystical fallacy. You say, this is the natural process. Well, natural doesn't really mean anything if we don't have an agreement on what the state of nature is, right? And I'm sure all of you will have an opinion about, okay, what are things just sort of naturally like in the world, right? Even if we take today's sort of advanced economy and industrialized, area that we live in, right? In Vegas, which Vegas is its own unique thing, right? We would still say, oh, the world around me acts this way. And some of you, right, that we happen to have a homeless population here at UNLV, right, which probably has been very much disturbed in this pandemic. And so their view of how the world is very, very different, right, than someone whose parents live here, who are successful, who got to stay at home, who have a house, right, who aren't taking a lot of student debt because their parents can help them through college, right? Their view of the world is incredibly different, right? And so that perspective really matters. And so nature can't be one thing if it's so different based on perspective. And so that's how we get to the mystical fallacy, right? And it's this, oh, the world is like this. Well, the world's not the same for every single person. And so that creates a fallacy because that logical argument has some clear flaws. The next is the and so fallacy and the misplaced concreteness fallacy. Now, when I talk about these two, the big thing that I want you to get, the thing that in this class is going to be the difference between the and so fallacy and the misplaced concreteness fallacy is the and so is saying, if these things are here, of course the next thing will happen, right? If you turn in all your assignments and you turn in the paper and you do the quiz, of course you're going to nail. Well, that's not testable. That's not falsifiable. It's not scientific, right? In order to be scientific, it has to be falsifiable. It has to be repeatable. Well, if I'm saying if you have A, B, and C, of course you're going to get the next thing, right? That's not testable. I'm saying this is the way it works, and there's nothing that you can do to say, well, what about this or this flaw, right? And because you say, and so it follows, right, there's no way to sort of contradict and it stops being scientific. The logic fails. And what it misses is other factors, right? It doesn't allow other factors, right? I'm going to use a religious example, but only as an example, not. And so when you hear people say, how do you know God exists, right? And so people will say, well, God is perfect, therefore he exists, right? This is sort of the circular argument. Ansos are often circular. And he exists, therefore he's, right, perfect. There's no way to test it. You're just like, nope, God's perfect, he exists, right? How could he not exist if he's perfect? How could he not exist, right? And so I'm not questioning that, I'm not discussing religion, I'm just using that example because there's no way to scientifically approach that. And in religion, you don't have to necessarily scientifically approach every question. That is the problem with Ansel fallacies. There's no way to test them. There's no way to treat them as scientific. And so the logic behind them doesn't work because we're scientists, right? We have to test everything. And so the logical argument can't be falsifiable. It's not scientific. The other logical fallacy that we discuss is this misplaced concreteness. And you say, everything that's happening is because of these 4 variables that I'm going to discuss. And that's only the variables that matter. And we have a very clear response to this, and it's called omitted variable bias. In statistics, we call it the omitted variable. And so whenever you say, I know exactly what's going to happen because these four variables explain so much of what's happening, if you have a flaw in your logic, you're going to get predictions that don't match reality. And what you're going to see is that there's going to be some variable, right? Often when we talk about parties and we talk about elections, we say, okay, who raised the most money? And usually the person who raised the most money has the most support, and therefore they get the most votes, and they're going to win the election. And we did see this a lot, right? That in the last presidential election, Biden actually, in certain stages, raised more. Obama raised way more than Hillary Clinton, and that's how we got him as the front runner when he was campaigning to be president in 2007 and 2008, rather than Hillary Clinton, because he was raising so much money, so it looked like he had more support. But we also need to see other factors, right? In California, you had a Democrat and a Republican running together, and the Republican raised way more money than the Democrat. But the Democrat still won. Why? Because California is a Democratic state, right? So yes, money can drive elections because it demonstrates support and outcomes, but what else are we missing? We need the demographics and the voters and the likely voters, right? We need all this other information. And misplaced concreteness sort of ignores those omitted variables, and those often cause flaws in the logic, right? When you say these are the only things that matter, I would always respond with suspicion because, or scrutiny, because I would say, well, are you sure these are the only things that matter? Have you looked at other options, right? And we've actually talked about this quite a bit. Whenever we see someone doing research, they have the independent variables and the dependent variables to test the relationship, but they also always include the control variables to say, these are things that normally impact this. So we want to include them, right? In the last year we talked about, we want to include these control variables. We expect it to have impact. So we want to make sure they're included in our analysis so we can say, no, we didn't omit anything. We included everything that should have an impact. We added something we believe also matters, and that should be a better approach, right? And that's how you solve a misplaced concreteness fallacy. And so those are 4 of just the many fallacies those 4 are the ones that we want to talk about, right? Because they have really important aspects to them that are going to impact the logic of our arguments and the validity of the arguments, right? Are the arguments valid is often dependent on whether or not they have these fallacies in them, right? And so when we go back, right, you have the historicist fallacy. This is how it happened historically. This is how it's going to happen in the future. No, new states deal with new environments. They should behave differently. So that's a historicist fallacy. A mystical fallacy, this is the natural process. And anytime someone says this is the natural process, what they typically mean is this is the traditional process. This is the way that it's been done, right? And historicist is this is the way it's been done in history, and the mystical fallacy is this is the natural way of doing things. This is the way that they'll naturally occur, right? If you have sunlight on a tree, right, it should blossom and grow and grow leaves and everything, right? Yeah, that's how it should happen in nature, but are you really describing nature, and is that state of nature really applied to the situation we're talking about? The and so fallacy, right? Is this still scientific? Or are you saying, nope, this is just follows, this tracks, this is how things work, I'm not going to answer any more questions, right? Obviously, there's a fallacy there, and the misplaced concreteness, which I also want you to know the omitted variable bias, right? So the first aspect of this article, right, by Wildowski, is that you have this basic argument of how parties will exist, but, right, they clearly have some logical fallacies. So let's talk about Duverger's state of nature, right? He says that nature happens a certain way. And when he's talking about nature, he's talking about the conditions in which elections occur. And so he starts with this basic premise that if you vote one time and there's only one winner, then you're going to have two parties, right? That's just how it's going to happen according to him, right? That you're going to have the incumbent and the opposition. And there are a lot of reasons we talked about this, right? You don't want to waste your vote, it's rational choice. You want to make sure your vote is going to a party that can win. But his argument that these two parties naturally form, not only do these two parties naturally form, but they form sort of a barrier, right? You can have a third party come in and replace one of the parties, but you will always return to this equilibrium of two parties. You're always going to come back to two parties if you have that type of election system. And so that is how nature works according to Duverger, and there's some special conditions, right? And Duverger says that these are very rare conditions. And we'll find they're not, right? There are a lot of states in the world, right? There are a lot of places in the world that have a third or fourth party because of some historical condition, because of some unique characteristic, right? Maybe they live in Catalonia in Spain and they just don't want to be part of their independence because they don't want to be part of Spain anymore. Or, right, you have the Scottish National Party, which we'll talk about in a minute, right? That just doesn't want to be part of the UK because of the referendum on Brexit, right? On exiting the European Union. Right? Scotland wants to be part of the European Union. It does better for trade and labor in the European Union. It doesn't want to be excluded, and so it's trying to carve out its own little piece where it can stay in the European Union. And one of the ways to do that is to be a separate state from the United Kingdom, completely separate its governments, right? Now, the UK doesn't want it to separate because it's got a large enough economy that it matters to the British economy. And so you have those interactions, right? You have independence parties, separate parties, where you have these ultra-conservative parties, these nationalist parties, these ethnic parties, right? And so there are clearly conditions that Duverger is ignoring, and he's saying that they're very rare, but when we look at the cases, they're not quite so rare. So, the next part is that before the 20th century, before the Cold War era, most parties were regional, right? You didn't have as many national parties as you do today. And so if you're a party in Kentucky, you're a Kentucky Republican, that's not even close to the same, right, as a California Republican. If you live in, right, the Sudan, right, and you live in the Southeast, your ethnicity is different than if you lived in the North. Right? And so you might be ostensibly in the same party, but it's a regional party. It doesn't extend to the national level. And so Duverger starts with this idea that centralization is natural. That when you have all of these little parties, they're going to come together for an economy of scale. And we talked about economy of scale before, right? It's just easier to get more productivity and more specialization if you have a larger national party than all of these little regional parties. And so Duverger makes this argument that you're going to just naturally come together on some issues that you can say are national issues, and you're going to coalesce into parties that deal with these national issues that sort of absorb the regional parties, right? And so you have this organization. Now, some of that is true, right? That parties, right, even though a California Republican and a Kentucky Republican are very different, and I'm not sort of I'm just using them so because they're very far apart geographically, not that they have some special characteristics. But you still can fall under one party, right? Northern and Southern people who are Northern and Southern British, right? They can all be in the Labour Party because what they can do is they can say, well, we can absorb all the money together, and then when there's an election, we can put it where it's most needed. We can hold these national issues, and we can make this argument that immigration or trade or things that happen in one part of the country affect the entire state, right? And so when you have those arguments, there is some nationalization in politics that happens where parties sort of form into larger groups. And so there is an economy of scale that you should expect for parties, but that doesn't mean it's natural, it's incentivized, right? And when we say it's natural, it's always going to lead in that direction. It may not always. You're going to have splintering, you're going to have splintering, you're going to have fracturing, you're going to have parties split off because they want some divide between them, right? So now let's talk about some terminology that maybe we haven't heard before. The first is an evolutionary deterministic theory. I already said, right, evolution is poorly understood by political science. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about an evolutionary deterministic theory is that there's this path, right? Think about being on a river, and you don't have paddles, you can't really direct it. The only thing you can do is stay in the boat and go down the river, right? That's path dependence, right? The only thing you can do is once you're on that path, once you're in the water, is to let the river take you down the flow, and you can't really change course, you're sort of stuck on that. And so, one, that eliminates agency, right? You don't have a choice in how things are going to happen. They're just going to happen as they should, right? And you just have to observe that as it happens, right? You can't change course, you can't really do a lot. The only thing you can really do is follow the boat and drown, or stay in the boat and follow along the path that is predetermined, right? That's an evolutionary deterministic theory. The most viable options will be the options that are adopted, and then they'll lead to this very specific path where there's national parties and elections determine the size of those parties. Now, this splits between deterministic, right? This is guaranteed to occur. If you have these conditions, they're sufficient, you will have this outcome. And something very different, which is probabilistic, right? Probabilistic is just that it's likely to occur. And so an evolutionary deterministic theory says, these are the natural order of events, these are the way that they're going to happen. And these are the conditions and the environments which will cause them, right? Obviously, there's an issue with that. Political science will always talk about this agency aspect. People know when they're on a river, right? If you were actually on, right, sort of imagine this, right? If you were actually on a boat in a river, you would figure out some way, right? You would just go down river until something happened. You would figure out some way to get out or to swim or to do something to change course, right? Especially if you knew that you were going the wrong way, right? You would find some way, grab onto something, or try and maneuver the boat in some way, create some drag so you can change the outcome, right? And so humans don't really work well with deterministic theories because often when they know the path is when they're most likely to change it. Right? If you, most of you are much too young for this, right? But sort of James Dean is historically sort of he's in a movie called Rebel Without a Cause, and he's asked, what are you rebelling against? And he says, what do you got, right? Humans naturally have this instinct of like, oh, this is the way things are going, I want to do something else, right? That's a very natural human thing to say, oh, right, it's sort of contrarian and difficult, right? But it's a natural thing. It's in our human behavior to say, oh, this is the way that things are going, I want to derail this in some way, right? It's very common. I hate to use that word, natural, but right, we have a biological instinct to not always go with the herd, right? There is part of us that wants to be different, not in the herd all the time, right? And if that makes us very different from sheep, right? Sheep will actually, if you direct them into a herd, they will sort of pull together because their biological instincts are to herd together, right? Humans have this thing where they want to sort of distance, they want to sort of be different from the rest of the people around them. The next part is a multi-causal approach. So a multi-causal approach is just something we talked about before, where there might be a bunch of different factors, and the factors might actually be pushing you in different directions, right? That if we're talking about elections and parties, you might have some, right, where if you have a single vote, right, majoritarian election, this is pushing the number of parties down, right, sort of depressing the number of parties. But that's just one factor pushing down, whereas if you have a lot of different ethnicities and religions, right, that's going to be pushing up. And so these factors will run into each other. And so what we need is a multi-causal approach, right? And we need the vectors, it's called a vector, right? The direction and the magnitude is the vector. So if you have all of these forces pushing in different directions, then the outcome's going to be very different, right? And some of them may have interactions, right? When these two run in together, they actually have some bigger effect, right? We call it emergent properties or interaction effects, right? If we're talking about statistics, interaction effects, we're talking about biology or environments, we're talking about emergent properties, right? And so we have to look at multi-causal approaches because there could be a lot of reasons this is happening, and some of those reasons could be canceling out. Right? Some of those reasons could have could sort of end up bumping into each other and having no effect because they bump into each other. And so Duverger is making this monoclause argument. He said it's one thing, it's just elections, and he's missing a lot of the other factors, the historical factors, right? The environmental factors that might cause an election to be different. So, right, let's look at two examples. We've talked about this, so let's really look at these two examples. The first one is the U.S., right? And we have historically two parties, right? And for those of you, right, I'm not expecting you to know the history of American parties, right? But one of the things that everyone learns in like high school and basic civics and even political science 101 here is that you have the Whig Party, right? You have the sort of Jeffersonian Republicans and the Whigs. And the Whigs aren't very good at their job. And so the Democrats replace the Whigs, right? So you have parties replacing each other. And then what you also have is when you have one party support. And so one of the things that Duverger says is, okay, well, you have two parties, they're going to be fighting for control. Well, there are a lot of times historically where one party just dominates, right? In the New Deal era, the Democrats take over in so many places because the population is rejecting Republican austerity. They say, nope, we're not doing that anymore. We want to get out of this depression, right? And so Democrats really take power. FDR's president 4 times. It triggers this rule where you can only be president twice, right? And so it's a huge shift. I'm going to use the party of Lincoln Republicans, right? They gained so much support during the Civil War, but also all the Democrats leave the Union, right? So you have the system, but also later in the 1960s, Republicans who were the sort of abolitionists, the anti-slavery, the pro-immigration, right, bring people in, and their values actually switch to the Democratic values, right? You have this party reformation in the 1960s, 1970s, where Republicans go right conservative, and liberals actually go left and liberal, right? Or Democrats go left and liberal, right? And you have this complete swap, right? And it's sort of this unique historical moment where they shift. But in that time period, the reason they shift is Republicans say we need to have national support, and they sort of sacrifice, they need Southern support. And so they sacrifice the presidency in order to have more of a role in Congress, right? And so, but they have such a strong role in Congress, which they've had since the 1960s, because they've embraced these sort of rural areas, and they've had really strong presence in Congress because of that, right? So you have one party support. Republicans have actually had more support in Congress over the last 50 years. And then in the 1980s, right, after the end during the Iranian Revolution, the Iran hostage crisis, right, Reagan comes in 1980, and you have the entire nation sort of come in around what's called Monday Morning in America, sort of return to normalcy again. We talk about this a lot, right? Biden is supposed to be a return to normalcy. Reagan was supposed to be a return to normalcy, right? There's all these times where presidents come in and say, let's get back to normal. And for Reagan, right, a lot of the support was like Reaganomics and trickle-down economics and things that people of color would probably say is horrific, right? But during that time, it was widely supported. Democrats voted for Reagan. Reagan was the solution, right? Jimmy Carter was not performing as well. He wasn't giving solutions, right? People didn't agree with his approaches. He was very sort of soft-handed, right? He was trying to do everything with diplomacy, and Reagan comes and says, we're going to force people to do what we want, and you have this coalition come together. And so what happens is you start to get one party support, and the other party, yes, it exists, but you don't really have two competitive parties. And so this happens. And then as you start to see party and public align, one of the things that you see is homogenous units, right? Everyone in this area shares policy preferences. And I shouldn't say everyone, but the majority of people in a specific area share policy preferences, right? People in the South want limited government intervention. Nevadans want libertarian values where the government doesn't get involved. They don't want to pay income tax. Right? Californians and New Yorkers, sort of coastal states, they want a more involved government, a more responsive government, right? So different aspects in different units, right? And the demographics actually start to filter in as well, right? one of the things that we have noticed that's sort of a little troubling is that almost every group self-segregates, right? There is a self-selection aspect where if you are, and I'm from California, so I have to use a different example, right? But in California, if you're Korean, you live in Salinas, in Monterey, right? There is a Korean community that you can go to, right? And San Francisco has Chinatown, and all of these communities are self-selecting. And I'm only using those because they're the most obvious examples that we have that people can refer to, not because they self-segregate at a higher level, there's a language, no, none of that's true. The only thing is that in California, everyone knows, Chinatown in San Francisco, right? It's historical, right? There was a Chinatown in Reno, right? And sort of historically, the government allowed people to burn it down, so it's a different aspect in Nevada. But you do have this self-segregation where every group, right? Every single group is sort of self-segregated in ways that we didn't expect, right? If you're from El Salvador and Guatemala, then you have different communities and you sort of self-segregate into those different communities, right? Even though they're both Latin-speaking countries, right? The Spanish-speaking countries, they're both in Latin America, right? They have similar issues, right? But they're still self-segregating. And so we're seeing one of those things where, yes, you have homogenous units because everyone's going to their corner, right? We're not interacting. And of course, right, whites have always been self-segregating, but historically in the United States, whites have also caused legal segregation, so that's something that's been covered. Not that it's not important, but it's covered and it's covered in other classes. The next part is there are non-electoral factors. And so one of the things that happens is this cultural shift, right? That there's this very famous quote by Nixon, and he says, we're all Keynesian now. And Keynesian economics, I don't expect you to know Keynesian economics, but the point is that everyone's like, no, we need to spend our way out of depressions. We need to spend our way out of problems. And this is actually a sound economic theory that when the economy goes down, government spending should go up to sort of spend our way so we can get the economy running again, and then use the new taxes from that growing economy to sort of spin down the debt and get into a position where we can be ready for the next boom and bust cycle, for the next bust, right? And so that becomes this sort of huge cultural shift. We sort of accept this. And then unionists, right, when we're talking about the party of Lincoln, right, that unionists say, no, we have to preserve the union, and then trickle down in economics, right? These are all in reference to the one-party support systems. And then racial, right? So until about the 1990s, there was this thing called a WASP. A WASP is just a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And we don't see this as much, right? We don't really see WASP sort of being as outspoken. But at the time, not only did you have to be white, but you had to be Anglo-Saxon white, right? Because peoples from the Caucasus region by Russia are white, and the Irish were not considered white, right? And so you had to be Anglo-Saxon white. That was the purest white that you could be, right? And then you had to be Protestant because there was rejection of Catholics, right? And the relationship between being Catholic and Irish and all of those things they run into a lot of issues of overlap. But before 1945, not only were there rules about being white, right, but there were rules about being Anglo-Saxon Protestant white, right? And so you create these WASPs. And in the 1980s and even going into the 1990s, there were all these really people who were very proud to be WASPs, right? They're like, I'm Anglo-Saxon, I'm the English white, right? And you're that German white or that Irish white, and so you're lesser, right? And so you see these non-electoral factors, and one of the things that become important for political parties and elections, is that Duverger is missing something, right? Until Kennedy, JFK, runs for election, a Catholic had never even been considered for president, and JFK was Catholic. And he had to prove that he would listen to the country before the Pope, right? That's the whole reason why Catholics is that connection to the Pope and sort of historical arguments about divided loyalty. And so when you have those factors, you eliminate certain parts of the population, right? That they can't run for office, they can't. And so when you change those rules, what can happen is you can have a lot of different parties because they're adopting newly enfranchised people, which we'll talk about in the next section. And then the last is the loyal opposition. And so this is something that's being talked about quite a bit. We don't have today two clear policy alternatives. If you look at it, we don't have two clear. We have it's us, them, right? We do have a divide, right? There's this partisan divide between Democrats and Republicans. And I know I'm spending a lot of time in the USA example, but I'm assuming that's an example that you know. So when I'm talking about parties, we can really understand the party aspects because you know the historical points. So when you have this loyal opposition, you expect a couple of things, right? And this is what we expect. We're not really seeing it as much today because there aren't clear policy choices. There's more sort of division, saying they're bad or they're not good people, or right. A colleague of mine called Biden the Antichrist, right? Obviously, you can't have a debate when you think that's the person who's going to bring the end of the world, right? You can't have debates in those situations. Without sort of that really derisive conversation, there is really great benefits from a loyal opposition. And we'll explain why you have such division in just a second. But one is that if I have a really strong opposition, an organized opposition, and say I'm a Republican today, right? Because the Democrats control Congress and the presidency. Not that I'm a Republican, not that it matters what I am, right? But if I organize and I say these are the values that Democrats aren't upholding, then I can make a real possibility that Democrats can lose the election. And the Democrats will have to respond, the party of the Democrats will have to respond, the Democratic Party will have to say, okay, what do the voters want? How do I be responsive to the voters? How do I be responsible and fix the problems of today? Right? And so that possibility of losing an election instills democratic values, right? They're competing over who gets into office, not trying to violently take power, right? And these are different aspects, right? And so parties can really hold that by having different values and really creating that possibility of losing an election. The other is they provide a scapegoat, right? You always want to blame the other party for any policy failures, right? I don't ever, okay, just as a real quick aside for 10 seconds, because I'm already behind. I don't want you to care about my values, right? Very important, I don't want you to care about us. So I'm going to pick on people, but not because I think they're worse, just the examples are more obvious, right? And I've said this before, so hopefully. Trump was very good at this. He was very effective at saying, look what the Democrats did, right? This is the Democrats' fault, right? Why is the wall not being built? It's because of the Democrats. And there are some congressional aspects, right? The House controls the money, right? And they really want funding wall construction. And all these other failures, right? Now we're talking about, right, Biden, right, and saying, okay, the crisis at the border is Biden's fault, right? Well, he's been in office a few months. It's starting to become his fault. But obviously there were some conditions there. There are some sort of seasonal conditions, right? And so he's going to say, no, this is a problem because of the policies of the last party, right? When he talks about why wasn't there common sense, right? When the Democrats have control, why isn't there common sense infrastructure bills? Why isn't there common sense gun reform, right? Well, he's going to say, look at Manchin, who's in the way, who's not letting us move forward. The Republicans won't meet us in the middle ground to get any infrastructure bills. He's going to say the Republicans are the reason why we can't do this, right? Even if it turns out that there's flaws in what he's doing, right? When we look at the Affordable Care Act, a piece of legislation that really did provide a lot of health care to a lot of people, but a very flawed policy. And during the rollout, during the Obama during the rollout, the website and the technology was so terrible that it made all of government look bad. That they couldn't even set up a proper website, that they couldn't even set up a proper healthcare system, healthcare insurance buying system on the internet, when that should have been a very easy task. It just wasn't functional after a year, when any kid in his basement, right, any computer scientist who knew what they were doing could set up a server system, right, in a couple of weeks, right? And so he would say, right, the Republicans got in the way and they tried to make it harder, but really that's just a way to scapegoat, right? That each party is blaming the other. And I use the presidency because most of us don't really pay attention to sort of lower level politics, right? Although Gavin Newsom is being recalled, right, for his handling of the pandemic. And so he's going to say, this is a national problem. The Republicans didn't let me have national support, right? Governor Sisolak is going to face a lot of pressure, right? And he's going to say, look, Republicans in Congress didn't give us the resources, right? And so there's going to be some scapegoating from governors as well, right? And I'm only using Governor Sisolak's our governor, and then Gavin Newsom is facing a recall election. The last part is the part that we don't have today in the American system, is that you should get really clear differences between policy. If you're pro-choice, you're going to fit well in the Democratic Party today. If you're pro-life, you're going to fit well in the Republican Party. If you're for spending, if you're Keynesian and you say, we need to have money from the government to get out of this problem we're facing, this economy needs to grow, and the government needs to spend money to build infrastructure, then you're going to fall into the Democratic Party. If you say, we need to lower taxes and have less services, what we call austerity, that's going to put you in the Republican Party. And so we don't have that on all issues, but that really does allow people to know that what they're facing without having to research every single thing, right? And so the loyal opposition really plays an important part of the democracy. And so this is something that Duverger gets right? The value of having two parties is very important because it gives you these clear stances, right? You know the difference between the two parties. You should know which one fits with your preferences, right? And you can blame one part or the other, right? So there's some escape, and that's not necessarily a good thing, right? But you can look at and say, I don't like what you're doing. I'm going to get rid of you and replace you with someone else. And that's why we have so many presidents change, parties change so often, is because often Americans say, I don't like the job you're doing. I'm going to replace you with the opposite of you, which is a Democrat or a Republican, and switch, right? That's why it's so hard to have a two-term president be replaced by someone of the same party, right? Reagan is replaced by George Bush Sr., but that is the last time that happened. And then what you have is sort of Clinton for 8 years, and then a Republican for 8 years, and then a Democrat for 8 years, and then Trump is a one-term president, but right, a lot of external factors. And then what we will likely see is a return to normal behavior where Biden is president for 8 years, and then Republican in 2028 takes over. Right, that it's unlikely that you'll have three Democratic presidents, Democrat Party presidents in a row, right? We'll normally switch. And that's part of this. We know the two different stances, and we can easily hold them accountable through the loyal opposition. So, Gladowski, the author here, makes 2 points, right? How should we study these parties, right? And the first is classification, right? So if we're talking about political parties, maybe we should look at who's in charge of the parties. Right? Who are the elites? Are we talking about traditional elites, landowning elites, right? They want an agrarian society, they want a caste system, right? We're talking about party elites, right? And party elites only get their power from the party. So do we want people who are tied to the party for their success, their life, their job, everything, right? Where their whole life is the party, right? In a worst case scenario, that's communism, right? The only way to advance is to be supportive of the Communist Party and go up to the Communist Party, right? Or do we want something in between, right? Do we want party elites? They gain political power, but they get their wealth from being businessmen and professionals and things like that. The next thing are who are the members. And elites represent less than one-tenth of 1%. So when you have a party, you need members from one of two groups. Middle class, when we're talking about middle class here, what we're talking about is professionals like an attorney or a doctor or people who, in the classic sense of the middle class, have a clear trade that gives them a lot of value, a lot of esteem, right? We're not, in today, working class would still include people like HVAC repair, electricians, right? They would still be sort of considered working class, right? And it sort of becomes this blue collar, white collar difference. And in American society, there are a lot of things that don't really fit in this very well anymore. Like where does an influencer fit? Is an influencer middle class, right? So it doesn't fit as clearly, but I want you to try and think about this as people who work in everyday jobs and they make enough to pay their bills, sort of the working class, but they don't have enough free time, right? They spend so much of their time working. They don't have enough free time and money to really be in politics that often, right? They're too busy with their lives as the working class. The middle class, their jobs have provided them not just enough money, but enough leisure time that they can be more engaged in politics. And that's the difference I want you to think about middle class and working class. Because salary doesn't really report that, right? Electricians make really good money. If you are looking, like what do I do? Electricians make very good money, but they're considered working class because they spend so much of their time working, right, that they don't have the leisure activity to go in. Right? The same thing with welders. Welders make very good money, but they're definitely working class because by the time they get off work, they're exhausted, right? They're not going to go out to a rally. They're not going to be as engaged. And also political engagement has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. And then, right, what aspects of life is the party involved in, right? We have political parties. The Democrats and the Republican Party in the United States, the Labor Party and the Liberal Dems and the Conservative Party in the UK, they are political parties only. A community party is a party that doesn't just take into account the political issues, but how you live in your world, right? And so these parties will often say, okay, we want to be part of your job, right? And sometimes we bleed into this with unions, right? Unions say, okay, we want to politicize what you do, right? Unions have to be supported politically, and so if you're in a union, your community and your political life are all in the political party, right? And then when we start to include personal life, is where you get into communism and socialism, right? Every aspect of your life is in the party, right? Communism says you have to be in every life, right? That I'm going to use sort of Russian, Soviet era communism as an example, but not all communism is the same, right? We don't want you to be certain religions because right, we don't want you to be Catholic. This becomes a very common historical reference, right? We don't want you to be Catholic because that's divided loyalty, right? We don't want you to associate with certain people because they don't really fit in with this community, right? We want to control every single part of your life. And so when you have a communist or a fascist or socialist party, every part of your life is in that party, right? And so these are very rare. The Chinese government has a party, the Communist Party. They're not as involved in people's lives, but they do a lot of censorship. The Chinese Communist Party is as close as we would have in the real world today, right? Even when you have a dictator, often dictators and authoritarian leaders, they don't care what you're praying to. They don't care what you're doing in your daily life, right? Saddam Hussein didn't care if the people in the state were Sunni or Shiite. That wasn't his main concern, right? His main concern was that they supported him financially, right? Provide him with the resources that he needed, right? And so that, even in dictators, they don't really want to roll in your personal life because it's very costly to control people's personal lives, right? So most parties only do the political, some get into the community, and very, very rarely do we see them in the personal life. Now that's one way, right? Let's classify these, right? If the elites are party elites, and this is middle class, and we're talking about a cadre party or different parties, right? Or a communist party, right? We're going to classify them. Well, classification is sort of putting everything in a box, right? I have these 6 boxes, and I'm going to put everyone in a box, right? But as soon as I say that, a lot of you are naturally going to think, well, what if it doesn't fit in a box, right? And so this becomes the next step or a different way of approaching. And you can really think about this in the sort of the quantitative versus qualitative as well, right? Maybe we shouldn't be trying to classify parties and put them in little boxes. What we should be doing is look at the context and the leaders and why they exist, right? That a descriptive aspect might be more important than a classification. And so if you have a party and it comes about because of revolution, right, then you're probably going to have a revolutionary party, the Revolutionary Guard, right? The party is going to be tied to that revolution. If you come through during a coup, right, if there's a military coup and then they set up a party, it's probably going to be a military party. There's going to be clear hierarchy, right? Generals are above lieutenants, right? And there are a lot of ranks that are in between. I just don't want to list the entire thing. Right? If you're a grassroots party, if you come up by having the masses behind you, right, the party's going to be different. If Bernie Sanders became the nominee and then the president, the Democratic Party would behave very differently than Biden. Biden's an establishment Democrat, right? And so his party is an establishment party, bipartisanship and policy and statesmanship and following these rules, these contact rules, right? He's closer to Manchin than maybe he wants to admit. But he is a different party. He causes the party to be different than if Bernie Sanders had become the candidate and won the election. So then we talk about who are the leaders, who's actually in charge. Do we have a very charismatic leader, right? And when you have a very charismatic leader, are they making populist appeals? They're saying, oh, let's all be excited about this, right? Sort of mobilizing. Do you have someone who's a party loyalist? Right? That one of the things that we are seeing is that when you become the leader of the party, anytime you're president or prime minister, you become the leader of the party. If you're the leader of the party, then are you loyal to the party or are you loyal to the public? Right? And these become two different goals, right? And Trump made it very clear party. Right? I'm loyal to the Republican Party. My base is Republicans. That's where I'm getting my support from. Right? He was a much more, even though he changed the party itself, he definitely was a party loyalist. Biden trying to make a distinction between himself and the party. Trying to say, I'm an American president, not a Democratic president, right? And so you have two different groups. One is pushing, right? The Trump administration tried to push against, tried to put the parties where they wanted it, and then run as the party as the support base, and Biden sort of sort of not in line with his party, sort of running into a lot of issues where his party is not working with him, but trying to expand his base to the American public, right? In two different approaches. And one's not better than the other, they're just different approaches, right? It's just about who the leaders are. And it gives us context about who the leaders are, how they came to power, why they behave the way that they're behaving, right, and all those things, and then the incentives, right? And one of the biggest things about parties that we often ignore is why they exist. And if there are rents, right, if there's oil in your country, then you're going to have more parties. Right? We've seen this time and time again in most states. If you have a lot of oil, right, and your economy's not that large, then you're going to end up with 8 or 9 parties. Because each one of those parties is going to try to get access to that oil rent, to that money, right? Those incentives exist. If you have a big bureaucracy, right, you're going to have parties pop up because they want to win office and put people in those patronage jobs, high-paying, low-difficulty jobs, right? And so those incentives really inform us a lot about what the parties exist and how they exist, right? And so one is a form of classification, and it's very useful, right? Don't think that I'm making an argument for one or the other. And one is descriptive. And descriptive will tell you about how it came about, right? But you can't generalize, right? If you say this is a unique case, you can't say then, okay, how do we compare that to other cases? If you say this is a unique case and only came about because of these conditions, unless some other state is in the same conditions, they're not comparable, right? Whereas when you classify and you say this one goes in box A and this one goes in box B, all the ones in box A can be compared. Or you can make comparisons between the parties in box A and the parties in box B, right? And so they have different benefits, right? Anytime that you want to generalize so that you can do analysis between groups, right, you're going to lose some details, right? But you're going to gain the ability to generalize, to be able to compare the two groups. As you get more and more details and more context, it's harder to compare different groups because you're saying each case is unique, but you're making sure you're catching all of those things, right? You limit the amount of bias that exists because you're looking at all of the details. And so one is called parsimony, right? And we're classifying as parsimony, right? I want to be able to have the most functional theories with the least amount of details, right? To make it as concise as possible. And the other is I want to include everything, a kitchen sink model. And I want to make sure I know all the details of this context, but that means I'm going to have a really hard time comparing it to other places, right? Because I'm going to say, no, they're not really comparable. Or, right, the reason they're different is because of this unique characteristic which can't be replicated, right? That maybe what happened in South Korea can't happen in Latin America because South Korea is near China. And right, they have that counterbalancing Black Knight effect. Or maybe it's because the culture in South Korea is different from the culture in Latin America, and that whenever you do that, it's hard to approach this scientifically, because you're saying, no, this case is unique, we can't really look at the factors and compare them, right? And so there's problems with descriptive and classification. They both have benefits and costs, right? And you should always think about what are the trade-offs, right? What are the trade-offs that we're facing? Okay. So let's talk about a few classifications of parties. So the first is a cadre party. A cadre party is traditional elites, right? This could be landowning, this could be robber barons, right? People with a lot of power and money, right? They're typically conservative. Now, one of the things about the United States that's very unique is both our parties are conservative. We think that we have a left and a right, but we're both mostly centrist conservative parties. Very few parties want to make dramatic change to the system. And when I say dramatic change, you have parties who want to be independent, who want to just leave. You have parties that say we have to reform the entire system from the ground up, right? You don't see Democrats or Republicans in the United States saying we should rewrite the Constitution. That's not an argument they come up with. For the most part, parties in the US and in the UK are like, let's stick with the way things are, and let's just make minor tweaks. Let's just change a little bit here or there to improve our situation, but let's not reinvent the entire system, right? So that is a cadre party, right? Normal elites, political elites, right? Wealthy elites. Very limited changes, right? Everyone wants to sort of stick with the status quo, right? And the conservative typically means someone who just defends the status quo, and the status quo is just the way things are, right? Anytime I say conservative, I typically just mean people who want to stay the way things were. Or who think they were a certain way, right? When we talk about conservatives, we talk about the 1950s. They think, oh, the 1950s were like this, we should be in the 1950s as they were like this, right? With high employment and jobs and things like that, right? But if you're a person of color, a female, a minority in any sense, right, different in any way, gay, transgender, any of those cases, the 1950s are a nightmare, right? And so often when conservatives talk about, let's stay in this situation, it's because that situation benefits them. Whereas you're anything other than white male, right, you're much better off as we move forward in time. Right? There's no past that's better for you if you're a minority or part of the LGBT community than there is the present, right? And so when we talk about conservatives, it fits for them and they don't want to change, right? They get it the way they like and they want to keep it that way. And Democrats and Republicans both fit in this category. The next is a mass party. And party elites, right? The only way to gain in a mass party is to be in the party, support the party, rise to the ranks of the party. It has a political and community life, so you need to be out in the community, right? Sometimes when we talk about socialist parties, we talk about sort of controlling life. But one of the aspects of the socialist party is that the community comes together and they're working together, and there's communal property and all these other factors that exist. Right? Social Security is a form of socialism, right? Unemployment insurance is a form of socialism, right? We all combine our resources and pay into a pool, and then if you need from that pool, you can take it, right? Food banks are a form of socialism, right? All of these things that we consider voluntary or that we pay into, we're like, well, I pay into it, so I'm going to get Social Security back, right? Well, the money you're paying now is going to other recipients, right? That's a communal effect, right? That's part of a socialist policy. And I don't mean that in any stigmatized form, which is actually, right, Social Security is called Social Security, right? So obviously it's a socialist policy, right? It's in the name where we sort of come together to fund people, and then when they get older, right, they can draw on that Social Security. And if they paid into it, they've earned it, right? That's how we separate what we consider socialism, what we think socialism is, and what we call Social Security in the United States. And then the last party is the devotee party. And a devotee party sort of just talks about we're going to be in all the aspects of your life. And the only two clear examples that I have is the Chinese Communist Party, right? One weird example about the Chinese Communist Party, I'm going to add this because in case it's not like clear. One of the things about this is just an example of the Chinese Communist Party and sort of controlling your personal life. The image of Winnie the Pooh is banned in China. And some of you already know this, and it's sort of this weird thing. The reason why Winnie the Pooh is banned in China is because the president, Xi Jinping, he is either sensitive or people have made reference that President Xi Jinping of China, looks like Winnie the Pooh. And because their physical similarities exist, right, and because it's offensive to sort of compare him to a cartoon bear, or a female cartoon bear, because Winnie the Pooh's female, whatever the reason is, right, that China has censors on internet searches that sort of ban any images of Winnie the Pooh, right? And so that's a weird personal aspect where you're like, oh, I remember this cartoon, and when I was younger, and I'm going to look it up, and it's not allowed in your state. That is a very clear, sort of funny, weird sort of thing that is in their personal life. And right, a much sadder is Tiananmen Square. Just gonna. I'm not worried about that. I want to say it's Xiamen, but if you search any version of Tiananmen Square, it's going to come up, right? And this was, right, during the Communist Party's rise, you had people who protested against it, and they got ran over by tanks. And there is this, in American history, there's this clear image of a protester completely unarmed standing in front of a tank and about to die from this tank and protest, right? And that history has been stripped from Chinese search engines and imagery, right? And so that's control of you. And then the Iranian aspect of this devotee party is just the theocracy element, right? That the religious council sort of determines whether or not you're a good person in that community, right? You can be arrested for violating religious rules. And so those are two cases of a devotee party. And I'm only using one in the Pooh because it's something that you can like remember later, that you can be like, okay, what's so personal about these parties? And if you're saying, I can't let you look at images of Winnie the Pooh because it looks like me, right? Or if I say, you know, I look like a turtle, so don't search engines of turtles, right? Don't look at pictures of turtles, and I block that from your search, right, because it bothers me, right? Then of course that's going to be very personal in your aspect, and it's not such a sad and depressing thing that you sort of push it out of your brain, right? For those of you who are political science majors, one of the things that you will find is if something's sad or people don't like it, they will push it out of their brain, and they'll push that memory out. They'll quite literally say, I don't want that memory, and not retain it, even if it's very important information, just because it's too sad or too difficult. Right? It's very normal. For non-majors, right, this is a normal factor that you'll run into quite a bit as you're going through school, right? The funny things you remember, the less funny you don't. You're like, that's sad, I don't want to deal with that. Unless it's so horrific that it later becomes like something you talk about. Right. The next part of classification of parties is this sort of how are they set up, right? Is it a two-party system, right? Do you retain two parties? In a two-party system, bipartisanship is very rare, right? They're split on the issues. If I'm on the left of the issue and you're on the right of the issue, it's very hard for us to come together. In a proportional representation system, which proportional representation we talked about, where a percentage of the population, if 10% of the population votes for you, you get 10% of the seats, you're going to have more small parties. Of course you're going to have more small parties. It's not a winner-take-all election. So you can say, oh yeah, we're only at 10%, we only represent 10% of the population, but we really represent the issues of those 10%, right? The Scottish National Party is a very clear example, which we'll talk about in a second, right? They only represent the Scottish. They don't represent the entire United Kingdom, they only represent the Scots. And so they are small, but because there's proportional representation in elections, or there's regional elections, right, that they can be just that party for that one section, right? And so this allows more small parties. And when you don't have 60% or 51% or a majority of the people in government from one party, you're naturally going to get coalitions, right? Angela Merkel has always had to take other parties and put them with her coalition to rule, right, to govern, to effectively govern. So if Angela Merkel has to do this in Germany, right, in the UK, we see the Labour Party having to pick up some Lib Dems or some other party to sort of have a majority so they can get things done, right, because majority votes are very common, right? If you have to get 51% of the representatives on your side, right, then you're going to form coalitions. But if you're in a two-party system, of course it's not going to happen, because either you have 51% or you don't, right? You can't really reach across the aisle when you're already 51%. That's why the U.S. is very unique right now, because they have 50%, and then they have a tiebreaker vote in the Senate, but Manchin doesn't want to move forward, right? So you have this one person holding the entire system. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We don't really talk about gatekeepers, but gatekeepers can be really bad, but they can also sort of hold back certain behaviors, right? Without gatekeepers, white Americans would have voted away the rights of minorities long ago, right? And they have multiple times tried to vote away the rights of minorities, and then gatekeepers like the Supreme Court, like people in the Senate, have said, no, you can't do that, right? So gatekeepers do fill a role. The other part that creates a multi-party system in this classification, right, you have a two-party simple majority ballot system, you have a majority system under proportional representation, and then you have this third case, which is not as common, which is a second ballot. And sometimes what happens is you have what's called a single transferable vote. And if you have a vote where you say, okay, in the first ballot, I'm going to vote for who I want, because I know in the second ballot there's only going to be a few options, then that's going to create more parties, because you might split into three different groups. And in the North, right, the Labour Party and the Liberal Dems are in power, and in the southern part, right, the Conservatives and the Labour Party are in power, right? Those are the parties that matter. And so this transferable vote to say, okay, I don't get my first choice, but I might get my second choice, it allows you to vote for your first choice, which allows more parties to have power. Even if you end up with two parties in control, those third and fourth parties can still be in the system, playing smaller roles, but still playing some role. Okay. So we talked a lot about the U.S. Let's really dive into this UK part, right? They have a conservative party, right, led by Boris Johnson, who's in charge right now. It is center-right, and it's a political party, right? There isn't community, and it's middle class, right? The Conservative Party is usually more middle class, white collar, typically more professionals, right? People who pay more in taxes, who don't want to pay as much in taxes. It's a very normal aspect of a conservative party, what we would consider the Republican Party, analog to the United States. Then the Labor Party, which is center-left, it's still only a political party, but it has a working class base, right? These are people who want better services, right? The Labor Party really pushed for universal health care in the United Kingdom, right? That was part of their aspect, right? We want more services for the people who need them, right? And so obviously I might be left biased, right? So I might be painting them in a better picture, but each of those parties sort of fit in that cadre classification. They're really only looking for you to be involved politically. They don't need your community life involved. They don't care about your personal life. As long as your personal life is legal, that's fine, right? That we see this a lot, right? I don't care what you do in the privacy of your own home. Are you going to support me in this vote? Are you going to support these policies? So the major Conservative and Labour Party in the UK really fits with that classification, right? We're going to classify them as cadre parties. The Scottish National Party doesn't make any sense in the classification. It doesn't fit any box very well because it's not based on policy. It's not based on left versus right, and so we call it a big tent party because it's only explained through historical context. The Scots don't want to be part of the United Kingdom. So their big issue, the issue that matters most to them, is independence. And so they might be center-right, they might be center-left. Scots might be split between the Labour and Conservative Party. But instead of being in the Labour or Conservative Party, because they don't want to be part of the United Kingdom at all, they've already all sort of come under this big tent of, let's leave the United Kingdom. Let's be part of the European Union, right? Let's be part of the European Union instead of being part of the United Kingdom. And so you have this big tent because you have all of these different issues and points of contention, but they're not as big an issue as independence. And if Scotland actually got independence, the Scottish National Party would probably dissolve into a center-left and center-right party. So this historical context of Scotland being controlled by the English, becoming the United Kingdom, right? These factors are explaining why that party exists when the classification system would not be very effective in doing that job. Okay, so I went a little longer than I wanted. This is the first of the two articles. The next article we're only going to talk about for a little while, mostly because I'm losing my voice again. So when we come back, we'll come back at 10 o'clock, and what we're going to talk about is how parties actually function. So we've given them classifications. Now let's talk about them functioning. Are they responsible or are they responsive? And these are different things, and they can't both exist, right? The more responsive you are, the less responsible you're being, right? Okay, so we're going to take a break for the next 13 minutes. We'll come back around 10 o'clock, and I hope to see you then. Let me see if I can actually end this. Thank you for stopping by.